So Bershus the Torah Kollel, Bershus the chaburah. So I wanted to hone in on an excellent point that Judge Salomson made when he spoke about corporations. So just a minute of background, and then we'll jump in. So there's a Machokes HaPoskim. Rav Asher Weiss says that a corporation is a Beria Chadasha. It's its own entity. The rules of the Torah don't apply to a corporation. And Me'ikar Adin, it's mutter for the corporation to lend money beribis. He says that a lot are machmir, and therefore it's better not to. But he says Me'ikar Adin, it's mutter. And many other poskim, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and if I understood correctly, our Rashi Kollel feel that a corporation is a shutafus. It's a group of Jews getting together as a shutafus, and therefore it's also for the corporation to lend money beribis. So when Judge Salomson discussed this topic, so he made an excellent point. He taught us that the law, or at least he taught me, that the law is that when a corporation, let's say a corporation lends money to borrowers, and then the corporation gets dissolved before the borrowers repay the corporation. So the partners in the corporation, after it's been dissolved, are no longer able to collect the remaining outstanding debt from the borrowers who hadn't yet paid the corporation while it was still in business. So he said, Bishlam, if you say like Rav Asher Weiss, that a corporation is its own entity, so then we understand this. The corporation lent money to the borrowers owe the money back to that entity of the corporation. When that entity exists, so they have to repay. When that entity no longer exists, so they don't have to repay. So then we would understand, that's nicho. But if we say that a corporation is a shutafus, so then it's owned by a group of shutafim, a group of Jews. So if the borrowers owe the Jews, they owe the shutafim. So how come when the corporation is dissolved, how come they no longer have to repay those shutafim? So this is going to happen in Dinei Yisrael. I'm sorry?
Who says that's going to be the result in Dinei Yisrael?
Rabbi saying they do have to pay.
Interesting. Okay, I didn't give that thought, so I'll give that more thought later. But
if the whole thing is accepting this non-Jewish, the Goyish Azat of a corporation and bringing you into halacha, without Rabbi Shita that is halacha and Korban Pesach, then why can't we use the same rules of corporation in American law?
You have to say that it's a condition of the Shutafus, and who's aware of that? It's not Minik Asayach, it's nothing. You got to find a judge to tell you that. People out there don't know that. Certainly nobody lends money to the hochim.
So I hope to defend the position of the Rashi Kollel in addition to that, but I guess that's a much more direct route. When people ask me what I'm speaking, so a number of people ask me what I'm speaking about today, so I told them I'm not sure if I should say that I'm speaking about Hilchos Ribis or I'm speaking about Shutafus. So L'chol HaPachos will have a chaburah on the union of Shutafus. But the underlying svara of this question is basically that if you don't have full ownership after the corporation is dissolved, then that's an indication that you don't really have full ownership while the corporation is still in business. If you don't have full ownership after the shutafus is split up, that indicates you don't have full ownership while the shutafus is still in business. So that's svara Rav Asher Weiss says, and I recognize you can't bring a raya from Rav Asher Weiss to Rav Asher Weiss, it just sounds like he's l'shitase, but he says that in a different context. Rav Asher Weiss says that idea in explaining why the board of directors of a corporation can't be viewed as the owners of the corporation. He says that after the corporation is dissolved, the board of directors no longer have any ownership. It's the shareholders who get it. So they have no longer any ownership. So you can't say that they had ownership beforehand. And he uses a lashon, a very powerful lashon. He says, Zoe ha'uchacha ha'elyona de'in lahem bayros kol sheni. The fact that they have no ownership after it's split is the best proof possible that they have no ownership before it's split. So that's in the context of explaining why the board of directors doesn't have ownership, aren't the owners of the corporation. And that's a totally different reason from Rav Asher Weiss's reason why a corporation is its own separate entity. For that, he explains differently. He says that ownership is usually expressed in 3 different ways. It's you take the profits, you make the daily decisions, you have the ability to transfer the property. And that, he says, is in the hands of 3 different people. It's the CEO makes the daily decisions, and the shareholders take the profits, and the board of directors gets to decide major decisions about transferring the property. So that's a separate reason. He doesn't rely on this svara for his basic shita that a corporation is a separate entity. There's a separate svara that he says that if you don't have ownership after something is split, that indicates that you didn't have ownership before it was split. So what I wanted to look into basically is what's the Havana in Shutafus in general? What's the Lomdus? How do we understand the Shutafus in general? And whether perhaps there's any understanding of Shutafus which would lend itself to understanding that even though you don't have ownership after it's split, you still have ownership while the Shutafus is intact. Now, just as an aside, no one's claiming that the partners don't have ownership after a corporation is dissolved. They do have ownership. They have ownership on anything that's muhsuk. It's almost like Yerusha Sabachor a little bit, like anything they get whatever was muhsuk in the corporation, they still get after it was split. The only thing that they don't have is they don't have the ability, or at least in secular law, they don't have the ability to get any remaining outstanding debt. So I know when it comes to a halva, it depends if they collect mos or they collect karka, whether it's considered roy. I'm just using that as an example, as a mashal, not as a limud. But they do have some degree of ownership after the corporation is split up. They just don't have complete ownership. So is there any way to understand Shutafus such that once the corporation is this or that, even if they don't have ownership after the company is split, we can still view them as having ownership before it's split? So the Mishnah says in the Darim in Parak Hashutfin shenadru hana zemizeh asurim likanes lechatzer. So if Shutfin take a neder, they're not going to benefit from one another, so they're not allowed to go into their jointly owned chatzer. That's the shita of the Rabbanon. And Rav Elihu ben Yaakov omer zenichnas l'soch shelo v'zenichnas l'soch shelo. Rav Elihu ben Yaakov holds that they can go into the chatzer. When I go into the chatzer, I'm using my portion of the chatzer. When he goes into the chatzer, he's using his portion, and I'm not benefiting from him. So the Ran explains based on the Gemara that this machokas is based on whether or not you hold yesh breira or ein breira. That Rav Elihu ben Yaakov holds yesh breira. So he says that when I go into the chatzer, huvar hadavar l'mafreya, that this is my portion in the chatzer that I'm going into, and same for my friend. When he goes into the chatzer, huvar hadavar, that's his portion. And the Rabbanan hold ein breira. So the Rabbanan say that when I go into the chatzer, perhaps I'm benefiting from his portion, and that's why it's aser. So the Ran asks a question on this. He says, first of all, if you say that each shutaf took a neder that to aser the other one, so how can it be that one person can aser on the other person like this? But even if, aside from that, he says, even if I took a neder myself that I'm not going to benefit from my shutaf, so he says, "Vafilu nadu gamkein hein atzman lama hein asurim harek shekol echad nichnas lechatzer misharohu ne'aneh v'lo mishal chaveiro kevan she'ein hara yachol akev alav." I have the right to use the chatzer. So if no one had taken any nedarim, I would be able to use the chatzer. So when I go into the chatzer, I'm exercising my right. So why is it that his neder is going to prevent me from exercising my right of using the chatzer? How am I benefiting from him? So because of that, the Ran explains how he understands the concept of Shutafus in general. So he says, "V'nirali dahainu tamayu derabanan." The reason why the Rabbanan say it's aser is because mishum kevan dei efshar lomar dechol chad kani l'kulei chatzer kinyan haguf ha'olam. Since you can't say that each one of them has a complete kinyan haguf over the chatzer, di demar rav demar, di demar rav demar. If it's mine, it's not his. If it's his, it's not mine. We can't both own the entire chatzer. You can't say that when I go into the chatzer, so it's 100% mine for that time period. When he goes in, it's 100% his for that time period. You can have a kinyan man, so okay, when I go in, it's entirely mine. The Rabbanan say you can't say that. De ein breira. Because ein breira, they're not willing to say that huvar hadavar, that when I go into the chatzer, it was mine for that time period. Ela kol chad mehanach shutfin yesh lo ha'olam b'chatzer zeh kinyan hagof, dahainu chelko, the kinyan shibud b'chelko shel chaveira, she'ein hara yochol ha'akiv alav min aden. Afal gav del kani regufos. The way the Rabbanan understand Shutafus, Lefi the Ran, is that I own 50% and he owns 50%. I have usage rights over his 50% and he has usage rights over my 50%. And then, because of that, Hilkal Kasavi Rabbanan, the Oso Kinyan Shibud, Shieshlo Al Chelko Shel Chaveiro, Konamos Mafkiyan Oso. That since we know that a Konam is Mafkiya Midei Shibud, so the neder is going to uproot my usage rights over his portion of the Chatzer. So that's what the Rabbanan hold. We each own 50% and we have usage rights over the other person's 50%. And when I'm using the Chatzer, so if I took a neder not to benefit from him, so that uproots my right to have usage rights over his half of the Chatzer, and that's why it's going to be aser. And Rav Elihu ben Yaakov argues, Rav Elihu ben Yaakov holds yesh breira. So Rav Elihu ben Yaakov holds that when I go into the Chatzer is entirely mine for that time period. So we have a machokas here as to how to understand Shutafus. Is it we each own half and have usage rights over the other half? Or is it that for the time that we're using it, it's 100% ours? So which one of these understandings is going to prevail a halacha? So the Ran asks a question. The Ran says, the Gemara here paskins like Rav Elihu ben Yaakov, that it's mutter for them to go into the Chatzer, which the Ran explains is because of yesh breira. But he says, don't we know from the Gemara in Beitza that by the Rabbanans we say yesh breira, and by the Oraisas we say ein breira. And here we're talking about a neder, which is a doraisa, so really we should paskin ein breira. So the Ran brings 4 answers to this question. The first answer is Rabbeinu Tam, who says that we pass him like Rav Elihu ben Yaakov, but not for his reason. Rav Elihu ben Yaakov says it's mutter for them to go into the Chatzer because yesh breira. We paskin by Daraisa as Ein Breira, but it's still mutter to go into the Chatzir because Vitor mutter b'mudar hana, something that anyone would be mochel on, that anyone would be willing to let you do, and no one minds if you walk through their backyard. So we say that that's mutter, either because you're not benefiting from him, or you're benefiting but not from him. He's mafkir. However, you're going to understand that. But the reason why it's mutter is because of Vitor mutter b'mudar hana. But really, we would hold by Daraisa Ein Breira. So it's the opinion of the Rabbanan's understanding of Shutafus, which would really be the understanding of Shutafus that would prevail. So Beinutam, if you're Beinutam, it's the Rabbanan's understanding of Shutafus that prevails. But the other three explanations, the other three answers to this question of the Ran, how come here it seems like we pass in Yesh Breira, if normally by Daraisa we pass in Ein Breira, all seem to line up with Rav Elihu ben Yaakov's understanding of Shutafus. The first answer is the Ri. The Ri holds that we pass in Yesh Breira even by Daraisas. And when the Gemara says in Beitza that we pass in like the opinion that b'derabbanan yesh breira, b'daraisa ein breira, that's only with regard to what that opinion said, that b'derabbanan yesh breira. But we don't hold like him when it comes to daraisas, we hold even by daraisas yesh breira. The next answer is the Ramban. The Ramban says that we'll say yesh breira here, even though it's a daraisa, because we don't really mean yesh breira, it's a code word. We basically just mean that this is the way shutfim use a chotzer. It doesn't make sense to say that a shutuf can ask on his fellow shutuf to use the chotzer. Ki agavna have tash mishtayu. This is the way they normally do things. This is how we understand shutfim splitting a chotzer, and we're just calling that yesh breira. And then the Ran answers that even though normally by daraisa we say ein breira, that's when the entire matter has to be clarified later. Like if you say Re'eza she'ertzeh garesh, so you don't even know who's going to be nisgari, who's going to be nisgareshes. So that's why there we'll say ein breira by daraisa. But here we know that whenever I want to use the chatzar, I can. Whenever he wants to use the chatzar, he can. The only thing that needs to be clarified in the future is which hour I'm going to use it and which hour he's going to use it. So for such a minimal breira, so we're willing to say a yesh breira even by a daraisa. But anyway, depending on which approach you take to this question will depend, whether you say the Rabbanan's understanding of Shutafus prevails or Rav Elihu ben Yaakov's understanding of Shutafus prevails. And I want to highlight for the time being Rabbeinu Tam's approach that we pass on like Rav Elihu ben Yaakov v'lo mitamei, and really follow the Rabbanan's understanding of Shutafus, and that the understanding of Shutafus that we would follow is that I own 50%, he owns 50%, and we each have usage rights on the other. So to contrast this, there's a Rashi in Bava Kama, and it could be that people will jump on me with my understanding of this Rashi, but that's okay because we're going to see that the Rashbam is in the same camp as Rashi. So whether I'm right or wrong with my read of Rashi, either way the Rashbam will suggest this understanding. But the Gemara in Bava Kama says, "Hamocher avdo la'acher upasak imo al manashi yeshamshenu shloshim yom." If I sell an eved to someone else, then we stipulate he's going to continue working for me for the first 30 days. So there's machokas tanoim there, and Rav Eliezer omer shneim einam bedin yom o yomayim. Neither one has the ptur by retzicha if the servant survives 24 hours. Zera fish eno tachta, v'zera fish eno kaspa. One only owns the kinyan haguf, the other one only owns the kinyan peiros. Amarava my time of Rav Eliezer. Amarakra ki kaspo hu kaspo hamiyuchad lo. So it has to be kaspo hamiyuchad lo for the ptur of yom o yomayim to apply. So the Gemara asks, "Kaman Ozla hada Amar Ameimar Ish ve'isha shemachru b'nichsei merog lo asu v'lo klum." Kaman Rav Eliezer. So this same Rav Eliezer would be the one who holds that if the husband and wife both try selling the nichsei merog, where she owns the kinyan haguf and he owns the kinyan peiros, you can't say that the sale would be invalid. So Rashi says lo asu v'lo klum she'eno lo razeh v'lo razeh. Neither one fully owns the nichsei merog. The meis echad mehem, and if one of them dies, the husband or wife dies, the hanishar, the surviving one, motzi midei alakuchos, can get the property back from the buyers. V'ro damu l'shutfin da'alma. It's not similar to regular shutfin. No one ever says that shutfin can't sell property. Of course, shutfin can sell property, but this is different from shutfin da'alma. The hasam yesh razeh cherek bekulo litol chetzi. I'll just finish the sentence, and then we'll hone in on that. Right here by shutfin yesh razeh cherek bekulo litol chetzi v'chein razeh. Avalhacha kulan knuyan ra leguf. She owns the guf of the nechsei merog. V'kulan knuyan ra peiros, and he owns the peiros of the nechsei merog. V'reikam yuchad ro razeh v'razeh, and it's not kaspam yuchad ro for either of them. But the Rashi's understanding of Shutafus is yesh razeh cherek bekulo litol chetzi v'chein razeh. So I thought, and you can jump on me on this, and then we'll just revert to using the Rashbam for this shita. But I thought that if he meant yesh razeh cherek bekulo, that each one owns 50% of the Shutafus, so then you don't need to say Rito Chetzi. You don't need to say Yesh Razeh Chelek B'Kuro Rito Chetzi. Of course, Yesh Razeh Chelek B'Kuro, I own 50%, so I get whatever I get from my 50%. Just say Yesh Razeh Chelek B'Kuro, Yesh Razeh Chelek B'Chein Razeh. So I think since he says Yesh Razeh Chelek B'Kuro Rito Chetzi, he means that each one has 100% ownership for the sake of taking 50% of the produce. And again, if you disagree with that read, that's fine. But if you'll accept that read, or if the Rashbam will say that shortly anyways, So then we'd have a machokas here whether the way to understand Shutafus is like the Rabbanon within the Ran, that each one owns 50% and has usage rights over the other 50%, or this Shita and Rashi maybe where each person owns 100% at the same time. Now how can that be? How can two people own 100% of the same thing? That was the Ran's kasha. The Ran said, two people can't own 100% of something at the same time. So first I thought, so the Ran makes a lot more sense logically. But then I thought about it a little more, and I thought maybe actually Rashi makes more sense. So I want to just, if it's okay, to say a Maimer of Agarata relating to this as a mashal, I guess, and then we'll get to Hilchas in a minute, but we just finished celebrating Shavuos. So Shavuos we celebrate Matan Torah. So how much of the Torah did the Ribono Shalom give me? So when Hashem gave the Torah to Moshe Rabbeinu, he gave it to Shevet Levi, and the rest of Klal Yisrael, the other Shvatim, said we want it too. So Moshe Rabbeinu was very happy to hear that, and he shared the Torah with everyone. So we got 1/12 of the Torah, I guess. Or maybe there have been 100 million people who have lived since Matan Torah. So we're celebrating the fact that we got 1/100 millionth of the Torah, because we can't all have the entire Torah, every one of us. And I'm not suggesting that we wouldn't have a yontif over 1/100 millionth of the Torah. Just Birshus, one more quick 30-second Miri Dagarata. I once heard a powerful Musar Shmuz from Nissen Kaplan, where he said, David HaMelech says, Tovi Torah Spicha Me'al Feizal V'chesef. So he says, why do we need a pasuk for this? David HaMelech needs a pasuk in Tehillim that teaches Kol Bar Be'Rav knows Tovi Torah Spicha Me'al Feizal V'chesef. So he said that imagine you had a choice. You could either be Rav Elihu minus one Tosfos and also the richest person in the world, or Rav Elihu with that Tosfos and the poorest person in the world. So that was the Chiddush of David HaMelech, that you should choose to be the Rav Elihu with that Tosfos, even if it costs you all the Ashiras in the world. So yeah, even if we only owned 1/100 millionth of the Torah, that would warrant a yontif for all of Klal Yisrael to celebrate Matan Torah. But my point is, presumably we're celebrating the fact that we all have the entire Torah. And one more maimer in Agadita, the Gemara in Sanhedrin says that the Kesar came to Rabban Gamliel and said, you say that the Shechina comes to every single minyan, and you also say there's one Ribono Shalom. How does this work out? If the Shechina comes to every minyan, how many Shechinas are there? So Rabban Gamliel called in the Kesar's servant and gave him a little slap and said, did you let the sun into the house of the Kesar this morning? And the servant said, what do you want from me? The sunlight goes into everybody's house. So Rabban Gamliel said, if the sun, which is just one servant to the Ribono Shalom, can get into everyone's house, so then certainly the Shechina can be at all the different minyanim. But my point from these mishalim is just you can have one item which everyone can have full bailas kilo over one item, but just the maimer and hilchas though. But so the Gemara says in Shabbos, normally if two people do a malacha at the same time, so the pasuk says me'ama aretz ba'asosa, so yachad shaso chayev shnayim shasau akturin. So normally if two people do the malacha together, so they're going to be pater. But there's a shita of Meir. Meir says that they're still chayev, even if zayachol, even if each one is individually able to do the malacha on their own, and they do it together. Meir holds they're still chayev. So the Gemara asks, inan shir razeh v'shir razeh, or dilma shir echad lekulam. So do you need a full shir you need two shiurim here, two of the measurement? Let's say they're carrying in the Rishos HaRabim. So if these two people are carrying 2 grogros, or they're carrying 1 grogeres. So the Gemara has a machokas. Rav Chisda Rav Amnuna. Chad amar shir razeh v'shir razeh, v'chad amar shir echad lekulam. So we have a shita. I can only be chayiv if I carry a full grogeres in the Rishos HaRabim, and he's only chayiv if he carries a full grogeres in the Rishos HaRabim. The two of us together carry 1 grogeres in the Rishos HaRabim, and we're each chayiv for carrying grogeres. How many grogros did we carry? We carried 1. And nonetheless, even though there's 1 item, there's some concept that since we each have a shaychus to this malacha, we're each doing it for the sake of these purposes. We can view it as if I did the full malacha and he did the full malacha, even though only 1 malacha was done. So I think this concept of Rashi is not such a crazy concept. But so at the end of the day, then, what's the machokas here between the Ran and Rashi? The Ran says each person in a Shutafus owns 50% and has usage rights over the other 50%. Rashi, perhaps, or maybe the Rashbam, says that each person owns 100% of the each person owns a full 100% of the entire item. So what are they arguing about? So I thought perhaps you could suggest that the Rashbam is in Bava Basra. The Rashi is in Bava Kama. We're going to get to the Rashbam in a minute. The Rashbam is in Bava Basra, Daf Kovav. So I thought perhaps you could suggest that the machokas is, the Ran says, how are we going to decide how much ownership you have over the Shutafus? It's based on what you'll get after the Shutafus is split. After Shutafus is split, we can't each own 100% of something after it's split. How much do I own now is viewed based on how much I would own independently, and he will own independently after we split. We can't each own 100% after it's split. Whereas perhaps Rashi says, no, we don't we don't focus on how much you'll own if you separate it. We focus right now. You have one item in front of you. You each have a shaychus of bailus to that one item. So we can view it as if you each own 100. It's a concept. It's a concept of bailus, and we can say that you each own 100% bailus so long as the shutafus is together. It's true. If the shutafus splits, you'll each own 50%, but that's not relevant to deciding how much ownership you have now. So if that's the case, perhaps we can say this point of that we started with, Judge Salomson's ha'ara, that when the shutafus splits, so the shutafim don't have a full degree of ownership. Does that mean, is that an indication that they don't have full ownership so long as the shutafus is still together? So perhaps you could say that's totally in this machokes. According to the Ran, yes, you only have so much ownership while the shutafus is intact as you'll have after it dissolves, after it's split. But according to Rashi, no, you can have 100% ownership on a shutafus regardless of how much ownership you'll have after it's split. Even though after it's split, you'll have a lower level of ownership. You won't be able to collect things that are ra'ui, perhaps. You'll only be entitled to the muhsuk, so you have a lower degree of ownership after it's split. But that doesn't impact the degree of ownership you have while it's together, while the shutafus is together. So I was happy with that explanation, but then I saw that the Kuntrasei Shiurim, Rav Gustman, has a different take on this, and he puts together the Shita of the Ran and the Shita of the Rashbam, which is in the same camp that we've been describing as Rashi. He quotes the Gemara in Bava Basra. He says, Tanya, the Gemara in Bava Basra says, Tanya Yossi Omer, Ha'achin shecholku, so you have brothers splitting up the Tusas Abayas, Kevan she'ala gora le'echad mehen, so let's say they split up with a lattery, so once the gora, the lattery lands, so kanu kulam, so once one of them, gets whatever he's entitled to for the lattery, so then the split is effective. They all get their portion. If the lottery was for all of them, they all get their portion. There's only one other brother, so he gets and the other brother gets the rest. So my time, Amr Belazar ketchilas Eretz Yisrael. Matchila begoral afkan begoral. Just like Eretz Yisrael was originally split up with a goral, so too the Tuzas Abayas can be split up with a goral. So the Gemara asks, Ima haran bekalpi v'urim metumim afkan bekalpi v'urim metumim. So then in addition to the goral, so then maybe you should also need an urim metumim, like they originally had an urim metumim when they split up Eretz Yisrael. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Ashi, with the benefit that the other one is also willing, that they're each willing to split with a lattery and to split right now and not to delay, so they're maknet to each other. So the Rashbam says, there are two ways you could read this. Either we're backing out from the limud of Tchilas Eretz Yisrael. We're not learning out that the goral is working. The goral worked in Eretz Yisrael, but for that you need the Urim Metumim. So here we're not learning that way. There's a new kinyan. They're each making a kinyan on their chelek. And that's the kinyan bahuana the katzai siradodi gamri umaknu radodi. So the Rashbam rejects that because then he says it should have said Ella Amar Rav Ashi. So the Rashbam says Pshat is Rav Ashi is just being metaking the original answer. Really, we're learning out from Tchilas Eretz Yisrael that Eretz Yisrael was split by Goral, so too the Tfusas Abayas can be split with a Goral. By Tchilas Eretz Yisrael was split. There was also Nurim Metumim. So he says whatever we're lacking now by the fact that we don't have the Nurim Metumim, somehow this Gamri Umakni Lahadodi fills in his mashlim for that, for whatever we gain from the Urim Metumim. So I'm not sure what that is, but putting that aside, the Rashbam says a lashon. He says va'afal gav. So the question is, the Rashbam is addressing, how can it be that they're each kona based on a goral? A goral is not really a form of kinyan. So how does this work? So the Rashbam says va'afal gav d'ro achazu kol echad b'shalo. They didn't make a kinyan in the portion that they received. The kevan de muchzakin va'omdin hein kulan b'chol hakarka. Since they were already muchzak va'omid in the entire Tusas Abayas, ein ha-goral makne lehen klum, ela mevarer lechol echad chelko ha-magio. The goral is just being mevarer what their portion is. They originally own the entire thing. Both brothers own the entire Tusas Abayas. So the way Rav Gustman says it in the Kuntrasei Shiurim is he says that he wants to say there's no machokas between the Ran, who says each one owns 50%, and this Rashbam, who says that each one owns 100%. And he uses the lashon koach and poel, that each Shutaf had 100% potential ownership, really actual ownership, but there's a mania. There's something preventing him from actualizing that ownership, and that someone else also has ownership. So that other person's ownership prevents you from actualizing your full ownership. And so what you're left with is each one has 50% ownership that they can actualize. But in reality, he says each one has 100% ownership, and he wants to say there's no machokas between this opinion of the Rashbam and the Ran. And he brings a proof to this idea that each one has complete ownership. He quotes a Shara Mishpat who says that if you have a Yisrael and a Ger who own a property b'shutfus, and then the Ger dies, and the Yisrael doesn't even know that the Ger died, he certainly didn't do any form of kinyan to be koneh, it doesn't matter, the Yisrael owns 100% of the property, no one else can come in and take it, the Ger doesn't have Yorshim, and the Yisrael who originally owned it b'shutfus owns 100% of the property. So why is that? He didn't make a kinyan on the Ger's half. So Rav Gustman says it's because of this. It's because he already owned, even b'shutfus, they both owned 100%. There was just a mania preventing them from actualizing that. Now that the other one died, so their kinyan expands. So it's not in terms of the kinyan expanding, but their ability to actualize the kinyan expands. And then he uses this also to explain the lashon at the beginning of Bava Basra, Ashutfin sheratzu lasos mechitza b'chatzer. So why does it say ratzu? Why doesn't it say shakanu? Especially if you're going to say that they need to make some type of kinyan in the property, because otherwise their agreement to split is just a kinyan dvarim. So he says, because if we would use the lashon of kanu, then we might think that the kinyan is an actual kinyan to be kona the land. And in reality, it's not. It's just we need a tangible way. Kanu b'yadam beruchos is just a tangible way of concretizing the agreement to split. But really, you don't need a kinyan on your chelik of the property that you receive, because you originally own the entire property, together with the other person who also originally owned the entire property. And that's why the Mishnah specifically said Ashutin sheratzu lasos mechitza, because it's just the ratzon alone which is sufficient for the chalukah. And even if you need a kanu b'yadam beruchos, that's just to concretize the ratzon, but you don't need another kinyan on the actual property. So if this is the case, then it comes out that there's not really any machokes between the Ran and the Rashbam. But it also comes out that both of them agree that each one has 100% ownership over the property so long as they're together. And then for sure, we don't say that you need to have ownership after the Shutafus is dissolved in order to have that degree of ownership while the Shutafus is still intact, because each one had 100% ownership while the Shutafus was intact, despite the fact that they're clearly not going to have Shutafus, they're not going to have ownership on 100% of the Shutafus once it's split. So then it would come out that both Shitas agree that the ownership after the split is not necessary to indicate the ownership before the split. There's another machokes there in Nadarim, which I think also could relate to our topic. The Gemara says, Amar Rav Yosef Amar Zeiri machokes she'ein ba kedei chaluka aval yesh ba kedei chaluka direi yakol aser. When did the Rabbanan and Rav Elazar argue in this case of a neder? And the person took a neder, that they're not going to benefit from their shutaf. So the Rabbanan say now it's aser for them to go into the chatzir, and Rav Elazar ben Yaakov says it's mutter. So when do they have that machokes? By a chatzir she'ein ba din chaluka, a chatzir that's so small that if they would split, you wouldn't really get any substantial. It's not really usable, the property that you would get. So that's when they argue. But if the property is much larger and you could force your shutaf to split with you, so then everyone would agree, even Rav Elazar ben Yaakov would agree that then it's aser in this case where you took a neder, it's aser to then go into the chatzir. So what's the reason for this? So the Ran explains, based on what he said before, that normally by a doraisa we say ein breira. The only reason why we say yesh breira here is because it's a much more minimal form of breira. That most of the matter was clear beforehand. That originally we knew I could use the chatzir whenever I wanted to. He could use the chatzir whenever he wanted to. It would be in my ownership when I'm using it, and his ownership when he's using it. And we just need to determine, which hour I'm going to use it and which hour he's going to use it. So when is that true? That's true by a chatzir she'ein ba kedei chaluka, where we know that I'll be able to use it whenever I want, because no one can impose on me a chaluka, so I'll always be able to use it. But by a chatzir she'yesh ba din chaluka, there's a possibility that we're going to split, and that I'll get the other half, and we can't say that I'll always have the ability to use it. So in order to say that I'm using what's really mine, we would need a full-out breira, and since it's a doraisa, we say, even according to Rav Elazar ben Yaakov, we would say ein breira. So that's the Gemara and the Ran's explanation, and then the Ran quotes a machokes between the Rashba and the Rambam. The Rashba says, because of our Rashba zal, not only is it aser for them to benefit from the chatzir, to use the chatzir before they split, even after they split the property, it's still aser for him to use the chatzir, the half that he received. You can't say that the property that I received, that's what I was originally supposed to receive, and I only can't benefit from the other person, but this is what I was supposed to receive, it should be mutter. You can't say that. That would require a full-out breira. So Rashba says not only is it aser to use the property before the chalukah, but it's also aser to use the property after the chalukah. And the Rambam disagrees. Rambam zal kasav v'agzayin milchos nedarim hayu shnei anshutin b'chatzer im yesh ba din chalukah harei elu asurim likanes ba ad shiachoku v'ikanes kol echad v'echad l'chalko. So the Rambam says it's aser until they split, and then each person goes and uses his own portion. Al masvira leizal d'ra'achar chalukah shari. So the Rambam holds after chalukah it's mutter then to use your portion. So why is that? Didn't we say that by a daraisa ein breira? Doesn't this require breira? V'nirari b'taimo zal da'afal gav d'kaimon d'daraisa ein breira. Afilu hachi anan sadi shalmanas kein nishtatfu shol yuchal echad mehen ra'asra al chaveiro b'inyan shtei ne'aseres alav le'achar chalukah di hachi asar arei nichsi didei ve'eno b'den. So we assume anan sadi that when they originally joined together into the Shutafus, it was almanas that someone shouldn't be able to, my fellow Shutaf should not be able to answer it on me permanently, because that's not fair that he's answering my property on me. So it was understanding, and it was a t'nai when they went into the Shutafus that the fellow Shutaf wouldn't do that, and that's why he can't answer it after chalukah. So on this, Rav Shimon Shkop asks, He says, if there's really a t'nai that we're joining into the Shutafus Almanas that you don't ask on me permanently, so if that's the case, then when the Shutaf goes ahead and takes a neder saying you can't benefit from me, so he's in violation of the t'nai. And if he's in violation of the t'nai, so nisbat ramaisa. So now we never really joined up to a Shutafus in the first place. We never were partners because you violated the condition of us joining up in a partnership. So now nisbatel the Shutafus. Well, if nisbatel Shutafus, then neither of us have any ownership over this property. If we don't have ownership over this property, you can't ask on someone else anything other than your own property. So if the property didn't belong to the two Shutfim, then you can't ask it. They can't ask it on anyone else. And if that's the case, why does the Rambam say that before their cholek it's aser? Same way that's mutter after their cholek because the t'nai has been violated. It should be it's mutter after the chalukah because the t'nai has been violated. It should also be mutter before the chalukah because the t'nai has been violated. They were never Shutfim. It was never their property, and it should be mutter. So originally, I thought when I saw that, I thought that maybe this wasn't like a formal t'nai. Maybe it's an ansadi shalmanas kain. I just thought maybe they were just establishing rules, like we saw in Bava Basra, that if you have two butchers, you can make a rule. I'm not going to work on your day. You're not going to work on my day. And Bnei Yair, like they can set rules, and there are rules that are governing their shutfis. And one of the rules is that any neder that you take, which would ask for the property on me after chalukah, will run into a brick wall. And then it would make a lot more sense that you take a neder and it's aser until the chalukah, and then it runs into a brick wall, and now it becomes mutter. But I guess the truth is, I thought about it more, and I guess Rosh Shimon makes a lot more sense because a neder has a chalos d'oraisa. So what does it mean? We create rules that create brick walls and prevent the chalos d'oraisa from continuing after the chalukah. So it makes sense. So the question makes sense. If the Ran is going to explain the reasoning of the Rambam that it's mutter after chalukah because there's this snai, then it should be mutter before the chalukah as well. So Rav Shimon has a chiddush that when two partners join up into a partnership, so there's actually two kinyanim. They make a joint kinyan for the duration of the shutfis, and then they also each have their own independent kinyan for after the shutfis is split up. That I'll have this half and you'll have that half after the shutfis is split up. So when a person takes a neder, they can ask their own property on you. So for the duration of the shutfis, when it's also their property, the neder is chal, and then you're not allowed to go into the chatzer. But after chalukah, so then the property becomes yours. Now it's true, it's the same piece of land. It's the same piece of land, but like we said before, you could have a kinyan lizman. So for the duration of the shutfis, it belonged to both of them, and the neder is chal and prevents the fellow shutf from going into the property. But after the chalukah, so then the same property, but now the half that I got belongs entirely to me, and the half he got belongs entirely to him, and because there's a new kinyan, and he can't take a neder to answer me on my property. So that's the explanation of the Rambam, that it's mutter after the chalukah and it's aser before the chalukah. So the Rashba, who disagrees and says that it's aser even after the chalukah, so and it's aser even after the chalukah, he doesn't hold to this idea that there are two kinyanim. He says there's one kinyan that you make at the beginning to create a joint shutfis, and it's that same kinyan which carries all the way through. When you do a chalukah and you split the property, if I end up with a property that was really his, and that's what we have to say, because ein breira by a doraisa, we're not willing to say that I'm ending up with my property originally, right? So then his neder continues even after the chalukah. Now when I first saw this, it took me more time to understand this, because how does this solve the problem of breira? Rav Shimon is saying within the Rambam, so there's a double kinyan. There's a kinyan for the period of the shutfis, the duration of the shutfis, and then there's a new kinyan for after the shutfis splits up, and the half that I get is mine, and the half that he gets is his. So who says that the half that I got is mine, and the half that he got is his? I mean, isn't this still running into a problem of breira? But then I realized it's not a problem of breira, because breira is only if there are multiple explanations for the difference between snai and breira. But one thing for sure is true: breira is when there's the chalos is before it's nisbarer. Like let's say you make an eruv, the eruv has to be chal on Erev Shabbos. So then if I'm not sure yet if I want to go to the east or to the west, and I decide Shabbos afternoon, depending on which direction the Rebbe comes or whatever it is, so that's a case where we need the chalos to be chal on Erev Shabbos, and it's not nisbarer until Shabbos afternoon, so that requires breira. Here it's true that the Masa Kinyan was when they joined up together in the Shutfis. But the chalos of the kinyan, it's like a kinyan to a baisa kinyan now to be konen and shloshim yom, that as long as it's in your property or whatever it is, as long as it's not torn up, so you can do a ma'asa kinyan to be chal later. So here, when they joined up in a shutfis, they did a ma'asa kinyan, and its chalos is after the split. So after the split, then it's clear which is your property. It is nisbarer b'shas the chalos. You did the ma'asa kinyan earlier, it was nisbarer b'shas chalos. So that's how Rav Shimon answers this question. And now just taking a step back, So again, we were discussing the point of whether or not you have to have complete ownership after the chalukah to indicate that you had ownership before the chalukah. So perhaps you could say it's tali on this machokas. If you say that there are two separate kinyanim, one kinyan for the duration of the shutfus and one kinyan for after the chalukah, so there's no reason to say that there's any connection between your ownership after the chalukah and your level of ownership before the chalukah. They're two separate kinyans and they're not related. But if you say like this, that's the Rambam. But if you say like the Rashba, that it's one kinyan all the way through, then it makes sense there should have to be some connection between your ownership after the chalukah and your ownership before the chalukah. So perhaps you could say that it's that is solely on that machokas as well. So just chazara, and then one more interesting point. So we saw a number of different understandings of shutfus. Do we each own 50%? Do we each own 100% for the duration that we're using it? Do we each own 100% at all times? And that's possible. Do we each own 100% actually, and we can only actualize 50%? And some of those machokas, maybe perhaps you could say, would affect how we view this question of whether or not you have to have ownership after a chalukah in order to have ownership before the chalukah. One other interesting point that I saw on the topic of shutfus, which doesn't directly relate to, it's another havana within shutfus, but I don't think connects to our machokas between Rav Asher Weiss and Shar Poskim. But I saw in the Minchas Asher was asked a question of if you have a hotel that's owned by Jews, b'shutfus, and Nachrim come to the hotel and they want to stay there from Friday night to Shabbos day, and then they're going to leave on Shabbos day. So is it a problem of Schar Shabbos? So he said that it's not a problem of Schar Shabbos for two reasons. The first reason he gives, which is not related to the union of Shutafus, but he says that it's Behavla, the same way that you can charge to use a mikvah Friday night, because you are allowed to charge for items that are used on Shabbos. You're not charging a fee for Shabbos. You're allowed to charge for items used on Shabbos, so you can charge for the firewood for the mikvah. So the same way that you're allowed to charge for that, and then you can charge for the mikvah Behavla, the Dmei Eitzim. So you're also able to, so if someone comes to a hotel, they're receiving all sorts of items. So in Behavla of that, you can also charge the fee for staying at the hotel. So that's his first reason why it's mutter. And his second reason why it's mutter, so he starts off by asking a question. He says that the Shulchan Aruch talks about a case where you have a Yisrael and a Nachri who own an oven b'shutfus. So it's mutter for the Yisrael to take his chelek of the schar from Shabbos as long as it's Behavla with the rest of the week. So he asks a question on that. He says, why is that considered Behavla? If you hire workers and you say, I'm hiring you for 30 days and I'm paying you $30 for 30 days, so that's Behavla. But if you say, I'm hiring you for 30 days, each day for $1, so that's usher. That's not considered Behavla, because the understanding is that, the reason why you said 30 days for $30, 1 day for $1, is because you want to have the option to back out. You're not committing to the whole 30 days. Each day stands independently. So even though you've, formulated it verbally as, 30 days, but since it's clear that each day stands by itself, that's a problem for Shabbos. So when the Yitzhak and the Shulchan Aruch say that when the Yisrael and Nachri own the oven b'shutfus, that's mutter to take the fee that people come and they pay to use the oven. So it's mutter for the Yisrael to take his chelek as long as it's Behavla b'shar yomim. But why is that the case? Why is it mutter? But that's not really Behavla. Obviously, it could be different people. One person came on Shabbos, one person came on Sunday, someone else came on Monday. It's not really Behavla. It's more similar to the case of 30 days and 1 day per $1. So he has a chiddush. He says that when money comes into a kupas ashutfus, so it's not like it's actually coming into your rishus yet. If you have shutvim who own, you have a joint account. So when the money goes into the joint account, it's not yet coming into your possession yet. So he says when it comes into the joint account, it's not Schar Shabbos because you haven't gotten it yet. And then when you take later everything together from the joint account, so that's not a problem of Schar Shabbos because that's Behavla. You're taking from the joint account Behavla together with everything else. The fact that the arrangement of the individual who came to pay the joint account was a standalone, for using the oven on Shabbos, that's not what's Koveya here. What's Koveya here is when you take the money. When are you taking the money? You're taking it Behavla with Shar Yomim. So what it sounds like from that is that perhaps you could say that the way a shutfus is working is that really each person owns like 0%, and they just have a schus to like 50% of the profits. That the kupas hashutfus really doesn't belong. The kupas hashutfus doesn't belong to either of them. They have 0% ownership in the kupas hashutfus. Otherwise, you'd have a problem with Schar Shabbos. But they have a schus to take 50% of the profits. The only thing I was thinking about that is that sounds to me like a dekel perosav, that you just own it for the sake, you own the joint account for the sake of taking the profits. The Rashi we saw earlier in Bava Kama had contrasted a case of where one person owns peros and one person owns guf to a case of shutfus, where he says the shutfus is a much higher level of ownership, as opposed to where one person owns guf, one person owns peros, that's a much lower level of ownership. Here it sounds like we're using that concept of a dekel perosav to explain shutfus, when maybe Rashi would say they're two different things, but in any case, I just wanted to conclude with one thing. I was thinking.
What it sounds like you were saying, I don't want to put words in your mouth, is that according to the latter approach, nobody owns it. So it goes back to the idea that nobody owns a corporation. The corporation owns it to itself. That's what I hear from that.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, I wonder how that plays in, because he only brings that in this tshuva when it comes to Shabbos. He doesn't mention this idea in the tshuva about corporation, but I hear that. I just wanted to look into whether or not there are any Gemaras I could think of that might address our original question about whether you have to have ownership after Shutafus is split to indicate you had ownership before it's split. So I don't think this is a raya, but maybe a siyua to support Judge Salomson's point. The Gemara is talking about Harsha. Gemara in Bava Kama says, "Amri na'ardai orchis adroksiv beizil don v'zachi v'apik anafshe cheis be mishasha." So if you have a Harsha, you want to send someone, you want to send the messenger to collect money from someone who owes you money, from the person who borrowed from you. So you have to say that they're collecting, for themselves. That it's their property, they own the loan, and they're going to collect for themselves, because otherwise they go to collect from the borrower, and the borrower will say, I don't really have anything to do with you, I don't have to give it over to you. So Amar Abaye says, if the shliach has partial ownership, so that's already enough. Since he has the right to say, I want you to repay me the chelek that's mine, he can also say, I want you to repay the part that goes to the original malva. Amar Ameimar itafas lo mafkinan minay. Ameimar says that if this messenger goes ahead and holds on to the money after the borrower pays him and he's supposed to bring it back to the lender, and he goes ahead and holds on to it, so you can't extract it from him. He's able to keep it. Rav Ashi Amar Kevan the Kasvei called the Misani Mindina Kavilas Arai Shliach Shavia. So Rav Ashi argues and says that since the Mishareach said that if you end up losing anything as a result of this process, so I'll be responsible, I'll pay you back. So if it really was the messenger's property, no one else would have to tell him they'll pay back for a loss. So it shows that this messenger is just a Shliach. The Ikad Amar Shutfa Shavia, and some say that the Mishareach, the Malva, was appointing him as a Shutif. The Ma'inaf Kamina, what's the difference between whether or not he's a Shliach or a Shutif? If he says, I'm going to keep half of it, is he able to keep half of it? The Hilchas Shliach Shavia, and the Gemara says that we pass in Shliach Shavia. So I was just thinking, why is he a Shutif? Why is he a Shutif if this messenger is being appointed as a Shutif? So he's being appointed as a Shutif just so that the other person can't say, we don't want the borrower to say, I don't owe you anything. So why can't we just say that he's appointed as a Shutif for the minute that it's necessary to be a Shutif? So he can say, I'm a Baldavar, I want you to repay me. And a minute later, so then he can go revert back to being a shliach. I mean, we all understand anyways, the point of this is shlichus. The shutafus is sort of like a trick, so there won't be a rabbi dvarim didita, no? So why can't he just be a shutaf for 1 minute and then revert to being a shliach? So I thought perhaps the Gemara is assuming such a thing can't be. If you have a shutafus in something, it's not paka bichdi. It can't be that you have a shutafus in something and then a minute later you don't have any ownership over it. So I thought maybe this is a support for that svara, that you have to have some ownership afterwards in order to have ownership beforehand. But anyway, I thought you could say this Tali maybe in some of these machokas rishonim, and perhaps this whole thing is superfluous anyways, based on Dinei Torah.
Did you take a look at the curvature in Mishnah? I think it's
I did not, but I'll write it down now.
He says this in, I think I quoted it, no? He says it in Tzusas Abayis of Einberger. I don't remember him quoting the Rashbam. Maybe he does. That I don't remember. But he says it in Tzusas Abayis. That's what Tzusas Abayis is all about. If there's Einberger.
Tzusas Abayis is Einberger.
Till from the Yerusha until Chalukah, what is it that's Einberger? Can't be good Muslim Friday, so what was it? He calls it exactly what you were talking about. I call it tendency by the entirety.
What?
You'll need to know it. It's a common law concept of marital property. The nafkamina is that no shutis can demand chalukah, and you can't sell it without the other. You have 100% ownership in the whole, and the other has 100% ownership in the whole. And if that's illogical, then it's not my problem. But that's how he explains the Zabayas.
Shkoyach.
Next week.